Number 1. Ernest Winston Angley stands beneath the bright lights of Grace Cathedral, a slight figure with a booming voice and a certainty that drew thousands. A North Carolina native who rose from small revival tents to international broadcasts, he became known as a faith healer and televangelist, a pastor whose television station and weekly services promised hope to the sick and the searching. To his followers, he was a shepherd. To his critics, the face of a ministry built on a single man's authority. In his later years, that authority and the money and loyalty attached to it would be tested in public, in court, and in the press. Inside the ministry, former members described a closed circle where obedience equaled spiritual maturity and service to church projects was treated as service to God. Angley's public image was unwavering, but age and declining attendance magnified tension around finances and control. The portrait that emerged was of an elderly leader guarding a legacy while insisting that sacrifice kept the mission alive. In that environment, pressure and piety sometimes sounded the same, and lines between devotion and duty blurred for congregants who wanted to belong. The most serious allegations were deeply personal. In late autumn of 2018, a former assistant pastor named Brock Miller filed a civil lawsuit, claiming that Angley sexually abused and harassed him for roughly a decade. Beginning in the mid-2000s, the complaint described encounters tied to the dynamics of mentorship and spiritual authority. Angley denied wrongdoing. After legal maneuvering through the next year, the parties reached a confidential settlement in mid-February of 2020, ending the case without a trial and without a public admission. The resolution left congregants divided, and the wider public focused on how easily power in a faith setting can go unchallenged. Money controversies followed a different legal path. Years earlier, the United States Department of Labor sued the ministry's cathedral buffet, arguing that congregants who volunteered at the restaurant were effectively employees entitled to wages. A federal district court initially agreed, but in mid-April of 2018, the United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit reversed, holding that wage law covers only those who expect compensation. The appellate opinion acknowledged that spiritual pressure may have influenced volunteers, yet it concluded that such pressure did not create an employment relationship under the statute. The reversal wiped out a large monetary judgment against the church in Angley. Financial strain still surfaced elsewhere. In mid-December of 2017, Akron press reports documented a lawsuit alleging that Grace Cathedral and its television arm defaulted on a multi-million-dollar loan, a snapshot of a ministry trying to maintain airtime, property, and payroll as audiences shifted. The case underscored a theme running through Angley's later years: the cost of sustaining a national broadcast footprint when an organization revolves around one aging figure. Investigations into the abuse claims never produced criminal charges. The dispute ended in civil court with that confidential agreement. Public reactions split along familiar lines. Former members said the legal filings matched patterns they had witnessed, while loyal congregants defended their pastor and questioned the accuser's motives. Reporters continued to uncover archival material, including a decades-old recording in which Angley acknowledged a sexual encounter, adding to a complicated record without delivering a courtroom verdict on character. The absence of a criminal case left the civil settlement and the ministry's internal culture as the main sources for outside judgment. What drove the behavior described by critics and alleged in court papers? No public psychological evaluation ever mapped Angley's inner life. Observers point instead to structural factors common to insular religious communities: a revered leader, high spiritual stakes, and the promise of belonging that can mute dissent. Authority confers access. Access begets secrecy, and secrecy can shield boundary, crossing conduct from scrutiny, whether framed by supporters as pastoral oversight or by detractors as coercion. The result was a ministry in which one man's words carried extraordinary weight. Ernest Winston Angley died in early May of 2021 at 99 years old in Ohio. By then, the wage and hour judgment had been overturned. The civil lawsuit with the former assistant pastor had been settled, and his church continued without criminal charges against him. Number 2. Apollo Quiboloy steps before his followers with the certainty of a man who calls himself the appointed Son of God. a pastor who built the kingdom of Jesus Christ from Davao City into a globe-spanning ministry and media network. In public, he projects calm authority and divinely sanctioned power. In private, former members describe a closed world ordered around his word. By the time he reached his mid-70s, that world collided with courts and prosecutors on both sides of the Pacific, and his title became evidence in a criminal record that accused him of turning faith into a tool of control. Raised in a deeply religious milieu and surrounded by loyal aides who managed properties, television airtime, and donation drives, he cultivated a larger-than-life persona. The promise was simple and absolute. Obedience brought blessing. Dissent invited judgment. Those dynamics, according to investigators and witnesses, created conditions where young women in his orbit were told their bodies and their silence were part of a spiritual mission. The church's own language for these attendants, pastorals, framed service to him as service to God, fusing piety with proximity to the leader. A federal grand jury in Southern California unsealed a superseding indictment in mid-November of 2021 that placed Quiboloy at the center of a coercive sex trafficking and labor trafficking scheme. Prosecutors alleged that girls and young women, some approximately 12 to 25 years old, were recruited to become personal assistants who cooked, cleaned, massaged, and, under threats of eternal damnation, performed so-called night duty for the pastor. The same case described a parallel machine of donation solicitation in the United States, using fraudulently obtained visas and a children's charity as a front, with proceeds funding church operations and the luxurious lifestyles of its leaders. Quiboloy denied wrongdoing. The pattern, say agents and court filings, mixed fear with reward. Women who complied received trips and privileges. Those who resisted reported verbal and physical intimidation and sermons broadcast to shame them. Workers who raised money in American cities allegedly slept in cars, surrendered their documents to church handlers, and cycled through sham marriages or student visas to stay in rotation. The picture was of a ministry whose internal rules operated like a private jurisdiction, with spiritual threats used to police behavior and extract labor and silence. In the Philippines, pressure mounted in the streets and in the legislature. After he repeatedly skipped hearings, the Senate authorized his arrest in late March of 2024, deepening a public showdown over accountability. Months later, Philippine police apprehended him after a tense standoff around his Davao compounds. He denied the allegations and initially claimed persecution, but within days, he appeared in court and entered not guilty pleas to child abuse and trafficking charges. The spectacle, an aging preacher in custody while former followers testified, riveted the country and reframed his influence as a question of law rather than loyalty. Across the ocean, American authorities made their pursuit explicit. The Federal Bureau of Investigation listed him on a wanted page tied to the California indictment, citing schemes that moved people and money under the banner of charity and faith. The United States also tightened financial pressure through sanctions, actions that named him for serious human rights concerns. As his Philippine cases advanced, Washington formally asked Manila to surrender him under the bilateral extradition treaty, a request acknowledged by diplomats and discussed by Philippine officials as legally viable even while local charges continue. The public response fractured along familiar lines. Loyalists framed him as a target of politics and a victim of religious harassment. Rights advocates and former congregants said the arrests and indictments validated years of warnings about coercion, secrecy, and abuse cloaked in doctrine. International outlets tracked the case as it moved from police raids to arraignments to extradition talks, noting his past ties to powerful politicians and the uneasy overlap of pulpit and power. Experts who study high-control religious groups point to structural motivations rather than a singular psychological diagnosis. A leader elevated beyond critique, a closed system that treats dissent as sin, and a theology that binds purity to proximity. In that environment, access becomes a currency, obedience becomes a test, and threats of cosmic punishment make ordinary safeguards feel like betrayal. Prosecutors argue that this mix produced both sexual exploitation and a fundraising engine disguised as charity. The defense counters that membership was voluntary and that the accusations distort sincere religious practice. As of early November of 2025, Apollo-Carrion Quiboloy, 74 years old at the time of his arrest in the Philippines, in early September of 2024, remains in Philippine custody facing local criminal cases. He has pleaded not guilty. The United States has requested his extradition in connection with federal charges filed in California, and Philippine officials have publicly discussed the legal basis for a temporary surrender while domestic prosecutions proceed. Number 3. James Orson Bakker stands at the center of a television set he helped invent. A man whose smile sold blessings, and whose letters asked viewers to keep the dream alive. In his late 40s, the Missouri-based televangelist had built the Praise the Lord Club and the Heritage USA Resort into a ministry empire, presenting himself as a creative pastor, a family man, and a tireless fundraiser. He and his then-wife, Tammy Faye, had become household names, their variety show gospel and tearful appeals drawing donations from across the country. Behind the cameras, reporters in Charlotte and federal investigators would later say, the books told a different story. Pressure was a constant, ratings to maintain, properties to finish, payroll to meet. Former aides described a leader who measured faith by loyalty and results, churning through projects with the urgency of a showman who feared the lights going dark. That urgency hardened when scandals closed in. The disclosure of hush money tied to Jessica Hahn triggered his resignation from the ministry and cracked the public image that had protected him for years. Accelerating scrutiny of how money moved inside PTL, Bakker acknowledged a sexual encounter but denied criminal wrongdoing. The real legal danger, it turned out, was financial. Prosecutors said the heart of the scheme was simple: sell lifetime partnerships that promised supporters an annual 3-night stay at a luxury hotel on the Heritage USA grounds. The problem, proven at trial, was arithmetic and intent. Tens of thousands bought in, but only one 500-room hotel was ever completed. The ministry sold far more partnerships than it could honor, while millions went to operating costs and personal bonuses. Contemporary accounts put the haul in the 9-figure range, and the personal take for Bakker in the multi-million-dollar range. The appeal of a Christian resort met the reality of oversold capacity and diverted funds. After a lengthy federal grand jury probe, an indictment charged mail fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy. In early October of 1989, a Charlotte jury convicted Bakker on 24 counts. That same month, a federal judge handed down a term measured in decades and a steep fine. 2 years later, the Fourth Circuit threw out that sentence, not the conviction, because the judge's money-grubbing preacher's remark showed improper bias, and a new hearing cut the time to single digits. Bakker ultimately served nearly 5 years before parole. The legal record is unambiguous. The verdict stood. Only the punishment changed. Public anger focused on the people who bought the promise: retirees, working families, church groups, many of whom never received the yearly rooms they were guaranteed. The story dominated national news and late-night jokes, but local coverage captured the human cost. Donors who trusted a pastor and felt betrayed when auditors and agents laid out how the money had been used. Heritage USA itself became a monument to unfinished plans and broken reservations. Years after prison, Bakker returned to television with a survivalist, end-times focus, broadcasting from Morningside in the Ozarks and marketing food buckets and devotional products. During the first pandemic year, he promoted a silver supplement as a cure-all. State and federal authorities intervened, and in late June of 2021, his ministry agreed to pay restitution and to stop making disease treatment claims about the product. The show continues, with episodes and schedules published by his own network. Experts and biographers point to a classic motivation in high-control ministries: a fusion of calling, celebrity, and access to donor funds that blurs the line between mission and self. The promise of building a Christian Disneyland invited ever larger asks. Once the model depended on constant growth, shortcuts followed. Journalists at the time emphasized the pattern rather than a diagnosis: ambition and entitlement wrapped in revival language, sustained by the trust of believers watching at home. As of late 2025, James Orson Bakker remains a free man, a convicted felon who served his reduced sentence, and later settled the Silver Solution case with Missouri authorities by agreeing to refunds and advertising limits. His program is still on air from Blue Eye, Missouri, and his ministry's website lists recent episodes and tapings. Number 4. Jimmy Lee Swaggart sits beneath the bright lights with a piano at his side. A Pentecostal preacher whose voice could rise from a whisper to a plea that held audiences across the world. Raised in rural Louisiana among church revivals and gospel harmonies, cousin to Jerry Lee Lewis and Mickey Gilley, he grew into a household name through televised sermons and songs, building a ministry centered in Baton Rouge that blended music, altar calls, and constant appeals to keep the broadcast on the air. By the height of the 1980s, his program reached far beyond the South, and his image, tearful, insistent, certain, was part of American religious life. Pressure and visibility moved in tandem. As the platform grew, so did scrutiny, especially after Swaggart publicly condemned other preachers for moral failings. That posture set the stage for a personal unraveling when private investigators and reporters began tracking his movements. Rival evangelist Marvin Gorman, whom Swaggart had criticized, helped surface photographs tied to encounters with a sex worker, a revelation that cut directly against the righteous persona Swaggart projected on air. The conflict between public preaching and private conduct became the lens through which his choices were judged. In mid-February of 1988, the scandal broke, and within days, Swaggart walked onto his television set to deliver the tearful confession that would echo across American culture. An admission of sin, a request for forgiveness, and a resignation from the pulpit under the Assemblies of God. Church leaders initially imposed a suspension with a path to restoration, but Swaggart rejected the full term. The denomination then defrocked him in early April, formally removing his ministerial credentials. The sequence was swift exposure, televised apology, and ecclesial discipline, and it left his sprawling ministry without its denominational covering. The following years delivered a second blow. In early autumn of 1991, California police stopped Swaggart for traffic violations and found he was accompanied by a woman who identified herself as a prostitute. News accounts relayed her statement, and the citations issued that morning. When he returned to his Baton Rouge congregation, Swaggart did not offer a detailed confession. He told them that the Lord had said the matter was none of their business. The contrast between the earlier televised repentance and this curt dismissal darkened public sentiment and accelerated the collapse of his national platform. Investigations in these episodes centered less on criminal charges and more on credibility, leadership fitness, and donor trust. There were no courtroom trials that put him behind bars. Instead, there were denominational proceedings, media exposes, and the quiet calculations of viewers deciding whether to keep sending checks. The Assemblies of God discipline ended his standing there. But Swaggart soon returned to preaching as an independent, continuing services at Family Worship Center and rebuilding a broadcast footprint outside denominational control. Over time, he launched radio and then television outlets under his ministry's umbrella, keeping sermons and music on the air despite a sharply reduced audience compared with his peak years. Psychologically, biographers and religion reporters describe a familiar pattern in charismatic ministries. A leader elevated beyond ordinary accountability, insulated by loyal staff, and sustained by constant public affirmation. The stage rewards intensity and certainty. The private life absorbs the aftershocks. When a preacher denounces the sins of others, that moral framing can fuel an all-or-nothing identity, making admission feel catastrophic and secrecy feel protective. In Swaggart's case, experts did not publish clinical assessments, but the record suggests a cycle of exposure, repentance language, and rapid return, a rhythm that preserved the brand even as trust eroded. Public reaction was polarized. Viewers who had been moved by his sermons felt heartbreak and anger. Late-night comedians turned the confession into a punchline, and within evangelical circles, the debate raged over restoration, discipline, and the costs of celebrity ministry. Baton Rouge remained his base of sympathy, with congregants who testified to changed lives and a choir that kept singing while cameras rolled for a smaller but persistent audience. Over decades, even as controversies flared like a widely criticized anti-gay remark in the early 2000s, his broadcast continued, now through a ministry-owned network that carried services, music, and teaching 24 hours a day. As a matter of record, Jimmy Lee Swaggart died in early July of 2025 at 90 years old in Louisiana. By then, he had long since been defrocked by the Assemblies of God, had returned to preaching as an independent, and had maintained a smaller but ongoing broadcast ministry led alongside his family. Number 5. Peter George Popoff strides down the aisle with a microphone in one hand and certainty in the other. A German-born American televangelist who, by the mid-1980s, was celebrated for calling out strangers' names, addresses, and ailments as if heaven whispered in his ear. In those years, he was about 40 years old. The charismatic face of traveling, healing, crusades, and television specials that promised deliverance to the faithful. Raised in a Pentecostal milieu and trained in the rhythms of revival, he projected warmth, urgency, and supernatural intimacy with God, building a public image that fused showmanship with salvation and drew donations from viewers who believed they were witnessing the miraculous. The strain of constant spectacle creates its own gravity. Former allies and skeptical observers described a ministry built around one man's voice and a system that prized dramatic, personal revelations on cue. That pressure to perform night after night, city after city, is the kind that can blur the line between authenticity and theater. And in Popoff's case, the theater was wired. In the spring of 1986, magician and skeptic James Randi worked with a surveillance expert to intercept radio transmissions that, when synced to Popoff's stage patter, revealed a different source for those divine details. A voice feeding him information collected from prayer cards and intake forms his audience had filled out before the service. On national television, the exposure landed with the force of a revelation. Randi debuted the tapes on Johnny Carson's late-night stage, playing the recorded voice of Popoff's wife, relaying names, street numbers, and illnesses, while Popoff, wearing a concealed earpiece, repeated them as prophetic words. The moment punctured his aura, not with theology, but with technology, and it reframed his most famous gift as an act of deception powered by radio. Within months, donations and ratings sagged, and the following year Popoff declared bankruptcy, listing hundreds of unpaid creditors and heavy ministry debt. There were no criminal indictments that sent him to prison, but the reputational collapse was nearly total, but not final. By the late 1990s and into the 2000s, Popoff reappeared in late-night infomercials with a new emphasis: small packets of so-called miracle spring water, accompanied by letters that promised breakthrough healing and even supernatural debt cancellation for those who followed his instructions and sowed a faith seed. Investigative reports from mainstream outlets and skeptics organizations chronicled the comeback, noting the blend of personal testimonies, prosperity claims, and relentless direct mail that fueled his return to the air. Regulators would eventually step in where audiences and denominations had not. In the United Kingdom, after multiple monitoring reviews of episodes that aired on a religious channel carried by satellite services, the National Communications Regulator concluded that the broadcasts repeatedly claimed or strongly implied that ordering the ministry's water could cure serious diseases and improve viewers' finances. In early March of 2025, Ofcom announced a significant fine against the channel's operator for serious breaches of the broadcasting code, citing the potential for harm in promoting medical and financial outcomes through a spiritual product and pointing specifically to Popoff's programming. The channel later said it would cease airing the show in Britain. The public response has long been split. To his supporters, Popoff is a bold man of faith whose critics misunderstand the ways of God and the language of miracles. To those who watched the earpiece tapes and read the regulator's decisions, he represents a pattern: compelling stagecraft, promises of immediate breakthrough, and a fundraising engine that turns private pain into televised spectacle. Scholars of new religious movements and professional debunkers alike point to the structural incentives at work: charisma rewarded with cash, testimonies amplified as proof, and a narrative that reframes any doubt as a test of loyalty. Psychologically, there is no public clinical evaluation of Popoff in the record, but the available evidence suggests motivation rooted less in sudden impulse than in a long-running performance loop, the expectation to deliver specific words of knowledge, the applause that follows a dramatic hit, and the financial feedback that accompanies emotional, on-air appeals. When the miraculous is promised on demand, the temptation to manufacture certainty can become part of the ministry's architecture, and the audience searching for hope becomes both congregation and customer. As a matter of record, Peter George Popoff was exposed for using hidden radio communications in the mid-1980s, declared bankruptcy the following year, later returned to television marketing his Miracle Spring Water, and, as of early 2025, remained active on air in North America, while a United Kingdom regulator fined a channel that carried his programs for harmful claims. Number 6. Tufik Benedictus Benny Hinn steps onto a brightly lit stage with a sweep of his arm and a quiet command to believe. Born in the Middle East and raised in a tight-knit immigrant family, he found his voice in the fervor of Pentecostal revivals, blending music, testimony, and promises of supernatural breakthrough. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, his television show carried those crusades into living rooms around the world, presenting him as a gentle but forceful healer whose touch could topple rows of people and whose prayers, he said, brought instant change. Supporters described him as a compassionate pastor. Critics saw a performer whose authority flowed from spectacle as much as from scripture. Behind the scenes, the pressures were relentless. An international itinerary, constant airtime to fill, and a donor base taught that faith looked like generosity. Scholars of high-control ministries warn that such systems can reward certainty and discourage transparency, especially when a single personality sits at the center. Over time, the drive to sustain impact can blur the lines between testimony and promise, and between ministry needs and a leader's comfort. In Hinn's world, lavish backdrops and dramatic moments became part of the expectation elements that drew both loyalty and suspicion. Questions about money and methods were not new. In the late 2000s, the United States Senate Finance Committee launched a broad review of several media-based ministries, including Benny Hinn Ministries, asking whether donations supported personal enrichment or legitimate charitable work. Staff later commended Hinn's organization for engaging with investigators and adopting reforms. The committee did not issue definitive findings of wrongdoing across the ministries it examined. The inquiry put his finances under a national microscope and signaled that the prosperity message would be judged not only in pulpits but also by auditors. Years later, federal agents arrived at his headquarters near Dallas. In late April of 2017, Internal Revenue Service criminal investigators and United States Postal Inspection Service officers executed a search warrant at the Grapevine, Texas offices of Benny Hinn Ministries, carrying out boxes while cameras watched. The ministry said it was fully cooperating. Public reports did not announce criminal charges stemming from that search, but the images of agents at the door amplified long-standing concerns about how donations were raised and spent. On the theology that fueled his fundraising, Hinn made headlines of his own. In early September of 2019, during a broadcast to his followers, he said he was correcting his teaching and that the blessings of God and miracles are not for sale. Christian outlets chronicled the moment and the mixed response. Some welcomed the words. Others questioned whether practices had truly changed. In the spring of 2024, he again reflected publicly, apologizing for prophecies he said were not from the Lord, and acknowledging regret over prosperity, preaching that, in his own words, had gone too far. The stagecraft that made him famous, sweeping gestures, lines of the sick, sudden testimonies also drew investigations by journalists and skeptics who said the healings lacked independent medical verification and that the most visibly infirm were seldom brought forward. Over the years, major broadcasters carried his program widely, then stepped away. By the mid-2020s, his website listed a more limited television footprint, while his own channels kept the brand alive. The arc tells a story of a spectacular rise, a period of retrenchment, and a continuing effort to stay on the air with a loyal core audience. What explains the pattern? There is no public clinical assessment of Hinn's psychology, but experts in religious movements point to structural incentives. When a ministry equates giving with breakthrough and centers that promise on a single leader, applause and donations become feedback loops. The preacher learns that certainty pays. The audience, searching for hope, learns that doubt feels disloyal. In such a system, excess can masquerade as faith, and course corrections, however, sincere struggle against the habits that made the platform powerful. As a matter of record, Benny Hinn's organization cooperated with a Senate Finance Committee review that closed without definitive findings of wrongdoing across the ministries examined. Federal agents searched his Texas headquarters in late April of 2017. He publicly renounced aspects of prosperity preaching in early September of 2019 and apologized in the spring of 2024 for inaccurate prophecies. And his television presence continues, though with fewer major network partners than in past decades. Number 7. Kenneth Max Copeland walks onto a brightly lit stage in North Texas with the ease of a man who has preached for decades, his voice carrying the promise of blessing and breakthrough. A former recording artist turned Pentecostal pastor, he built Eagle Mountain International Church and a global broadcast called The Believer's Voice of Victory, presenting himself as a faith teacher who connects generosity to divine favor. His public image is confident and polished. His ministry footprint includes a private airfield near Fort Worth and a sprawling lakeside residence recognized under clergy housing law. Supporters see bold stewardship. Critics see prosperity teaching that made a preacher indistinguishable from a brand. Pressure and praise can mold a ministry around a single personality. Copeland's sermons link spoken faith to material increase, a message that rewards certainty and makes giving a test of trust. As his audience grew, so did expectations. More airtime, more conferences, and more visible symbols of success. Investigative reporters and watchdogs argue that this closed-loop teaching that gifts unlock favor, while the teacher's lifestyle exemplifies harvest blurs boundaries between mission and personal benefit, especially when financial transparency is limited. During a United States Senate Finance Committee review of several televangelist ministries, staff scrutinized compensation, housing, and aircraft policies, reflecting national concern about how donations are used inside prosperity ministries. The inquiry ended years later without penalties or definitive findings of wrongdoing across the group. But it placed Copeland's operations under an unusual spotlight. The sharpest public controversies centered on aircraft and image. Copeland's ministry owns and operates a private airport, listed in Federal Aviation Administration records as a privately owned field under Kenneth Copeland Ministries. News features and local investigations over the years have examined ministry jets and questioned personal use. Copeland has defended the aircraft as tools for a global mission. In a widely viewed on-camera exchange in the late 2010s, he told a television reporter that commercial flights are a tube full of demons, later explaining he needed privacy to pray and to arrive rested for ministry events. Months after that exchange, regional outlets reported he had acquired a Gulfstream 5 from actor and filmmaker Tyler Perry, a purchase he framed as a providential provision for the work. Money and property drew their own headlines. Houston Chronicle reporters detailed how a large lakeside mansion owned by his church qualifies as a parsonage under Texas law, conferring a 100% property tax exemption. Subsequent summaries by national outlets amplified the valuation figures cited in that report and emphasized that the exemption is lawful under state statute. Years earlier, disputes over aircraft tax treatment led to litigation with the local appraisal district. A later Senate staff memo noted that the case ultimately settled without forcing the ministry to disclose executive compensation. The pattern was consistent: aggressive stewardship of legal advantages, robust defense of privacy, and continuing scrutiny from journalists who argued that donors deserved clearer accounting. There was no criminal fraud case that put Kenneth Copeland on trial, but the investigation environment around him was persistent. The Senate inquiry asked whether personal enrichment flowed from charitable gifts. Its conclusion, no penalties and no definitive findings, left policy questions to voluntary accountability bodies. Meanwhile, the optics of luxury never stopped drawing attention. Commentary shows replayed the jet exchanges. Local stations revisited earlier, reporting about ministry travel, and aviation listings kept the private airport's existence in the public record. For admirers, the trappings testified to God's provision. For critics, they signaled a theology that treats opulence as proof. Psychologically, scholars of high-profile ministries describe a structural incentive rather than a singular diagnosis. When a pastor's words are equated with spiritual authority and donations, are framed as seeds that guarantee harvest, applause and revenue reinforce one another. A leader can come to view access to aircraft and grand homes as ministry necessities rather than personal luxuries, especially when travel schedules are heavy and audiences expect spectacle. Media blowback then feeds an oppositional narrative inside the movement. Criticism is persecution, and prosperity is vindication, making reform difficult without threatening the very identity the platform is built upon. Analyses of Copeland's interviews and responses show a consistent posture: gratitude for God's favor, insistence on the legitimacy of his needs, and dismissal of outside judgments. As a matter of record, Kenneth Max Copeland continues to lead Eagle Mountain International Church and Kenneth Copeland Ministries in North Texas. His organization was among those reviewed during the United States Senate Finance Committee's multi-year inquiry that ended without penalties. His ministry operates a private airfield, and his church-owned residence receives a Texas parsonage tax exemption under state law. Number 8. Creflo Augustus Dollar Jr. stands before a packed sanctuary in College Park, Georgia. The polished voice of World Changers Church International, and a charismatic proponent of prosperity as proof of faith. In his public story, he is a pastor, author, and broadcaster. In private, he is the leader of a tight-knit ministry network whose brand is excellence, speed, and global reach. He was 50 years old when police in suburban Atlanta arrested him on misdemeanor allegations after a conflict at home, charges that officials later dismissed. That moment, paired with years of questions about money and lifestyle, turned a gifted communicator into one of the most divisive figures in American televangelism. The trigger that fixed his image in the public mind arrived not in a courtroom, but on the internet. In the early spring of 2015, his ministry launched Project G650, asking supporters around the world to help acquire a Gulfstream G650, a long-range business jet, by sewing a love gift, $300 at a time. The campaign framed the aircraft as necessary after a decades-old ministry jet had been damaged, and as essential to move teams and supplies for international missions. The pitch vanished within days amid fierce backlash. But within a few months, the church's board announced it still intended to acquire a G650 at a time, place, and price of its choosing, calling the aircraft a reflection of the organization's standard of excellence. Reporters and fact-checkers pored over the justifications. One widely repeated claim from a ministry spokesperson that teams sometimes carried tens of thousands of pounds of food on flights was rated pants on fire by a nonpartisan outlet, highlighting how the rationale strained basic aviation facts. For critics, the episode crystallized the logic of the prosperity message: give generously, expect blessing, and trust the leader's needs as ministry necessities. For supporters, it was an attack on a pastor's vision to reach the world without airline delays or limitations. The jet controversy did not arise in a vacuum. Years earlier, Senator Charles Grassley's staff at the United States Senate Finance Committee had opened a sweeping inquiry into 6 media-driven ministries, including Creflo Dollars, seeking details on compensation, housing, and use of church assets. Dollar disputed Congress's authority and resisted full cooperation, arguing that only the Internal Revenue Service had jurisdiction. When the multi-year review ended, the committee imposed no penalties and made no definitive findings of wrongdoing across the group, but the process placed his finances under an unusual national spotlight. Investigations flared again in other forms. In the early summer of 2012, Fayette County authorities arrested Dollar after a family dispute. National outlets reported the allegations and his denial. The following January, state court officials dismissed the simple assault charge, closing the case. The legal record on that incident is straightforward: an arrest and a dismissal, with no conviction. Across these cycles, Dollar's preaching continued to link faith, confession, and material increase. Then, in early July of 2022, he startled followers and critics by saying publicly that he had taught tithing incorrectly, urging congregants to throw away his old materials on the subject unless they aligned with his new message of grace-based giving. Some praised the admission. Others questioned whether it meaningfully changed the fundraising practices that sustained his platform. Psychologically, there is no public clinical assessment of Creflo Dollar to map motive. Scholars who study high-profile ministries instead point to structural incentives. A single, confident voice at the center. A prosperity framework that interprets luxury as testimony, and a donor relationship where giving is cast as a test of trust. In such systems, aircraft, parsonage benefits, and broadcast infrastructure can be narrated as tools of harvest rather than symbols of excess, making outside criticism feel like persecution and internal reform feel like betrayal of the brand. The G650 saga, the Senate scrutiny, and the later tithing reversal all fit that pattern of pressure, defense, and recalibration. As a matter of record, Creflo Augustus Dollar Jr. leads World Changers Church International from College Park, Georgia. His 2015 jet fundraising appeal was withdrawn after backlash, though his board later said it would still pursue a Gulfstream G650. He was arrested at 50, and the related misdemeanor charge was dismissed the next year, and the Senate's multi-year review concluded with no penalties or definitive findings across the ministries examined. Number 9. Ted Arthur Haggard stands at the center of a booming Colorado megachurch. A gifted preacher with a politician's ease and a pastor's cadence. At about 50 years old in the mid-2000s, he leads New Life Church in Colorado Springs and serves as president of the National Association of Evangelicals, a post that gives him unusual access to national power. He is a husband and father, a public conservative voice, and a symbol of the movement's confidence. To his congregation and television audience, he appears certain and disciplined, a shepherd calling a nation back to righteousness. That image will not survive the month of November in the year 2006. The unraveling begins with a radio interview in Denver and a man named Mike Jones, a massage therapist who says he has met the pastor regularly over roughly 3 years. Jones claims the meetings included sex and methamphetamine, and says he came forward because the pastor had publicly opposed same-sex marriage. The allegations strike at the core of Haggard's public stance and arrive in the final days of a heated state ballot fight. Haggard first denies the claims. Then, as reporters collect voicemails and contradictions, he concedes pieces of the story. Within hours, cameras gather outside his home. Haggard tells a local television station that he did buy methamphetamine but threw it away, and that he received a massage yet did not have sex. The carefully chosen words do not stop the tide. Church leaders place him on leave. 2 days later, he resigns from the National Association. By the end of that weekend, he sends a letter to his church confessing sexual immorality, language that shatters the persona his followers trusted. The admission is not a courtroom plea. It is a pastoral confession written to a stunned congregation. An internal investigation at New Life moves quickly. The Board of Overseers announces that Haggard has committed sexually immoral conduct and removes him as senior pastor. Counseling begins under the guidance of outside ministers, and for a season he leaves the state as part of a separation agreement. The consequences are organizational as well as personal. A flagship church must steady itself. A national association installs new leadership, and a once celebrated voice goes silent except for brief statements of contrition. The scandal does not end with the first headlines. Years later, New Life confirms that it reached a confidential civil settlement with a former church volunteer after allegations of inappropriate conduct during the period before Haggard's fall. The church frames the agreement as a pastoral decision for everyone's well-being. The amount and terms are not made public. There is no criminal prosecution arising from those claims. But the story returns to the news and deepens doubts about the years when his influence was at its height. In time, Haggard returns to Colorado Springs. He preaches again, first in living rooms and rented spaces, and then by founding St. James Church, presenting it as a community for people in crisis and for those who believe in second chances. National and international outlets profile the comeback with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. His wife, Gail, stands beside him. The sermons stress grace and resilience. The shadow of the past refuses to lift entirely. More recently, new accusations surface. In the summer of 2022, local and national religion reporters describe allegations from within St. James of drug use and inappropriate behavior toward young men. One account relates a confrontation in which Haggard allegedly admitted possessing methamphetamine and asked friends to remove it from his home. Other claims speak to boundary-crossing conversations and encounters. Haggard disputes wrongdoing. Authorities do not announce criminal charges. But the reports lead to leadership changes and the eventual sale of the St. James facility, followed by smaller, home-based gatherings under his direction. The psychological story is less a diagnosis than a pattern familiar to scholars of charismatic movements. A leader's public certainty becomes a kind of currency. The platform rewards intensity. Accountability can erode when staff and donors are emotionally invested in the brand. For someone who preached moral clarity while navigating private conflict, the incentives to manage appearances are powerful, and the costs of disclosure feel existential. No court-ordered evaluation has mapped Haggard's inner life. The public record shows cycles of denial, confession, removal, and return. As a matter of record, Ted Arthur Haggard admitted sexual immorality in early November of 2006, resigned from New Life Church and the National Association of Evangelicals, saw a later civil settlement reached with a former church volunteer, founded St. James Church in 2010, and, after further allegations reported in 2022, continues ministry on a smaller scale in Colorado while denying criminal wrongdoing. Number 10. Eddie Lee Long steps onto the New Birth Missionary Baptist Church stage draped in tailored suits and the certainty of a man whose sermons promise victory. A Charlotte-born pastor who rose to lead a sprawling megachurch in suburban Atlanta, he cultivated a public image of discipline, generosity, and prosperity. In the mid-2000s, as his congregation swelled into the tens of thousands and his profile expanded through television and civic activism, he projected moral clarity and financial success as signs of divine favor. That carefully built persona would be tested when young men from within his orbit described a very different life behind the pulpit. Pressure followed visibility. Long's theology leaned hard into prosperity, teaching the idea that sacrificial giving invites material blessing, and his church culture reflected excellence, speed, and expansion. Scholars and commentators noted that such a framework confused spiritual authority with financial appeals, making the pastor's lifestyle both a testimony and a fundraising tool. In this environment, gifts from the leader are framed as paternal care, and loyalty can be measured in offerings and obedience. That mix of charisma, money, and moral messaging set the stage for a devastating clash between public preaching and private allegations. In early autumn of 2010, 4 former congregants filed civil lawsuits in Georgia, alleging that Long used his position to coerce them beginning when they were teens into sexual relationships sealed with trips, cash, cars, and designer goods. News accounts identified the men and detailed claims of gifts and travel to New York, Las Vegas, the Caribbean, and overseas destinations. Long denied the allegations from the pulpit and through counsel, casting the charges as attacks. A 5th accuser later came forward. The suits were civil, not criminal. But the filings painted a pattern of mentorship that blurred into manipulation, with luxury as both lure and hush. The legal resolution arrived months later. In late spring of 2011, Long and the plaintiffs reached confidential settlements. Court records soon reflected dismissals with prejudice, ending the cases without a trial and without any admission of wrongdoing. Separate from the misconduct suits, Long and his ministry had already drawn scrutiny from Washington. Years earlier, the United States Senate Finance Committee opened a wide-ranging review into several televangelist organizations, including Eddie L. Long Ministries, seeking details on compensation, housing, and use of church assets. When the inquiry concluded in early 2011, it recommended voluntary reforms, but imposed no penalties and issued no definitive findings of wrongdoing. Money controversies returned from a different angle. Members of New Birth sued after a visiting investment promoter, Ephraim Taylor, pitched churchgoers from Long's pulpit, leading to losses later prosecuted by federal authorities. Reporting and court records showed Taylor ultimately pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit fraud. admitting he deceived hundreds of victims, including new birth congregants. While the criminal liability attached to Taylor not too long, the episode deepened questions about how spiritual trust can be leveraged for financial schemes. When a pastor's endorsement confers credibility, public reaction to the misconduct settlements was polarized. Former members and advocates said the agreements validated long-voiced concerns. Loyalists emphasized that the cases were civil and that their pastor had not been criminally charged. Media outlets chronicled the human fallout: men who said a father figure exploited them, families who felt betrayed, and a congregation struggling to reconcile a beloved leader's denials with court papers that never faced cross-examination. Subsequent reporting noted that a book project by accusers was curtailed by the confidentiality terms of the settlement, underscoring how civil agreements can end litigation while leaving narratives contested. Psychologically, there is no public, court-ordered evaluation of Eddie Long. Experts who study high-control religious environments point instead to structural incentives: a revered leader, a theology that equates wealth with favor, and a closed culture where dissent feels like disloyalty. In such systems, gifts can be framed as pastoral blessing. Boundaries can erode under the language of mentorship, and followers may hesitate to question a man who proclaims destiny over their lives. That dynamic, filtered through prosperity preaching and celebrity, offers a plausible lens for understanding how accusations of coercion and financial imprudence can coexist with passionate defenses from the faithful. As a matter of record, Eddie Lee Long reached confidential civil settlements with multiple accusers in late May of 2011, after which the cases were dismissed with prejudice. His ministry was among those reviewed in the United States Senate Finance Committee's multi-year inquiry that ended without penalties. His congregation later faced losses in the Ephraim Taylor fraud scheme, for which Taylor pleaded guilty in federal court. And Long died in mid-January of 2017 after what the church called an aggressive form of cancer.